Good morning everybody in the room and everybody in webinar land. Welcome to the final seminar of 2018. My name's Jim, I'm one of the nurse educators for Insight. And first of all I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners and custodians of the land of which we meet today and pay our respect to elders past, present and emerging, and I would like to pass on that welcome and respect to any Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islanders that might have joined us in the room or indeed on webinar land. So welcome, thank you. So today it gives me great pleasure to introduce the Clinical Director for Metro North, Dr. Jeremy Hayllar, who's a friend of mine and somebody that I've always looked up to since I've been in the Alcohol and Drug Service in Australia. So please welcome Dr. Jeremy Hayllar to talk about what's happening in Portugal at the moment. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Jim. Good to have you on board. So.
Left and right.
I was very lucky in June to join Ivan Frkovic, the Mental Health Commissioner, in a trip to Portugal, paid for by myself, so this is no junket. I don't know about Ivan, of course, I'll leave him to explain that. So 4 of us went. I've got a few photos, a few reflections, and then a bit of a kind of where next set of slides. I don't want to just be preaching to the converted, because I imagine most of you in this room, by virtue of your work and your commitment, will kind of feel this is a no-brainer. We need to find alternatives to the war on drugs. Working out what those alternatives should be is clearly challenging. So we all know that the war on drugs was christened by Richard Nixon. He had a number of problems at the time on the home front, and he decided that if we distracted attention and invented this problem, which was also mixed up with racism and kind of a long history of suppression in the US, then he could distract attention from his problems, and it probably worked for a while, but in the end reality caught up with him, as we know. I saw recently someone describing this as not so much a war on drugs as a war on drug users, and I think that's incredibly accurate. And really it's been tailored to provide a means of social control, using imprisonment, targeting certain disadvantaged and racial groups. So this is not an ethical or human rights informed approach. And this is, I think, one of the big weaknesses and flaws in the war on drugs, is that it really does affect different groups very, very differently. And those who are white and privileged are able to sail above that, avoid the sanctions and the terrible consequences which can flow. Just remind ourselves that the European Parliament, they screened the toilets there a couple of years ago, and in 97% of toilet areas, traces of cocaine were found. So, you know, this is the drug that politicians choose to use. They're not all being sent to jail as a result. We know what happened with prohibition. I found quite a nice quote in a document that I'll refer to later. The harder the law enforcement, the harder the drugs. So in prohibition in the 20s in the US, beer became almost unavailable as people moved to spirits and wine, so more concentrated sources of their product. And then it became moonshine, so distilled spirits, highly concentrated. So the idea is you reduce the volume of your product to reduce the risks of detection and ease transport. And we can see what's happening now in the US, where perhaps prescription opioids are moving, users are moving to heroin, which is much cheaper when their health insurance runs out. And now we know that heroin is being contaminated with fentanyl and derivatives of fentanyl, carfentanil, which are greatly more powerful than the old heroin itself. So the harder the law enforcement, the harder the drugs become. We'll then discuss a bit about Portugal, this idea of the Goldilocks principle, so there's some sort of sweet spot, not too hot, not too cold, where regulation might produce a more ethically informed and useful approach to drugs. One conclusion can be drawn: the doomsday predictions are simply wrong. Removing criminal sanctions for possession and use of drugs does not lead to skyrocketing prevalence rates. So this is quite a nice report from the UK, looking around the world at what's happened in individual countries. Quite a lot of detail, which was very interesting. So they're really highlighting that one of the scare tactics used is, if we don't have strict laws, then everyone's going to go crazy with drug use, and that simply hasn't been borne out by experience around the globe. NDARC did a report on what Australians think about decriminalising or changing our approach, and what's quite interesting is that slowly things have been changing. So cannabis, a kind of softer, and then heroin, a harder illicit drug. We now have nearly 80% of the population supporting decriminalisation of cannabis, and over 50% heroin. Slightly smaller numbers for methamphetamine, interestingly, which is perceived by nearly half the population as the major drug problem in the country at the moment. And what we can see over 6 years, the 3 household surveys there, is slowly these figures are creeping up. So there is a growing and greater consensus. However, a bit like same-sex marriage, that majority view does not necessarily translate into change without enormous upheavals and repercussions. So we talk a bit about the 3 pillars. So this is one of the questions from the household survey. How do you think the drug budget should be distributed? So in yellow, we've got law enforcement. In 2004, 44% of spending people wanted to go on law enforcement. Now in 2016, that's dropped to 36%. In terms of treatment, 26 to 29%, so that's increasing. This is what people think should happen, not what does happen. The next slide will show what actually happens. And finally, education, which is not always effective, as we know, and something that often the big pharma, big tobacco, big alcohol favour. They think just educate people and that'll be enough. So we talk about the 3 pillars. Perhaps we should have a 4th pillar, which is treatment services, which more specifically addresses the mismatch between potential treatment demand and the actual provision of treatment around the country. So here's the actual pie chart, and unfortunately we still have this huge focus on law enforcement. That's slipped off there, sorry. So, with a relatively smaller focus on treatment and prevention, which I guess is the same as education. So of those $1.3 billion government spent on illicit drugs, most of it is for border control and interdiction and police activities. And as we'll see later, they really have almost no effect on availability, supply, and the business of illicit drugs. We should follow the money, of course. This highlights that in terms of the expenditure by the Australian government, alcohol has a huge impact in terms of health expenditure, whereas for illicit drugs, those consequences are relatively much smaller, so less than 10%, whereas it's crime where the real impact happens. So we're focusing a lot of this government expenditure on the war on drugs, and it's a waste of money, I'm afraid. We do have some sense of change coming, not from the United Nations Organization of Drugs and Crime, a very unfortunate juxtaposition, because those 2 agencies being wrapped together, they think of things in one way, as a criminal reflection of drug use, don't they? So not a very helpful coming together. So their latest report showing that in almost every metric things are getting worse, not better. the international community needs to step up its responses to meet the growing challenge. So, same old, isn't it? Around the globe, about $100 billion is spent on drug-related law enforcement. So enormous resources being allocated. So in the face of those two statements, substance use now involves illicit substance use, about 250 million people around the globe. And that's a 20% increase over the last 10 to 15 years. More than 30 countries, or around 30 countries, depending on definition, have some level of decriminalisation, and we'll discuss a bit more what that actually involves. And we've seen in the US with cannabis that the states have sort of rushed ahead. This is in effect an experiment where the evidence is rather lagging behind, partly because of the illegal status has made it very hard for researchers to get funding and do work in this area. So an unintended consequence, you might say. And what we've seen also is states moving from medicinal cannabis to recreational cannabis approval. That doesn't apply at the federal level, of course, so there's this weird business that the profits of your sales of cannabis, for example, can't be banked because federally that is a crime. And so people are driving around with car bootloads of dollars, and it's quite messy. Canada, the Supreme Court has recognised this should be someone's right to use cannabis, so overnight almost recreational use was allowed. There are 14 different regimes operating across the provinces, so it's another fascinating natural experiment, from entirely state supplied to local entrepreneurs to buyers clubs, a huge range, and that's useful because it'll help if we're going to develop models in the future. We were talking earlier today about what's available on the deep net. I tried going on there once, I couldn't make much sense of it, but obviously our users are much more intelligent and savvy. So you can buy almost anything you want, and the quality doesn't seem too bad, and the likelihood of interception is almost zero. Other manifestations of the war on drug users, Maria, the Philippines, Duterte, 27,000 extrajudicial killings or so. This has been used as a pretext for wiping out people you don't like, or who threaten you, or who are, for some reason, not in agreement with you. And the situation in Mexico is unbelievably terrible. There's a book by Roberto Bolaño called 2666. I suppose 666 is about the devil, describing the drug war in Mexico and the deaths, and it is relentless and incredibly depressing. So about half of those homicides are drug-related. There's gangs, there's no-go zones, and the results are really chilling and terrible. And this is a kind of theme that we see through the war on drugs, that often it is the developing and non-developed countries where the worst consequences of the demand from the first world or the developed world for these substances appear. So you might say West Africa, or in Southeast Asia, Mexico, in South America and Central America. So to Lisbon. 1st of July 2001, they brought in new laws on drug use and possession. Not legalisation or depenalisation. So depenalisation means it's still an offence but there's no punishment. Legalisation means you're allowed to wander around with it. So there's still some sort of sanction process. And for those familiar with UK law, which has spread around the Commonwealth, one thinks of criminal law and civil law. There's a third category in continental European countries, which is spread around administrative law and administrative offences. So it's a bit hard for us to grasp that, but it becomes an administrative offence. So we need to think about the context in Portugal a bit. From the 20s to the 70s, it was really a military dictatorship. Democracy came in 74 with the Carnation Revolution. In the 90s, there was a massive HIV epidemic, and it really affected almost every family in the country. So everyone knew of someone or was related to someone who had contracted HIV. So there was a big effort to make an informed response. an expert panel was assembled with 13 members. They had 84 recommendations, and the government at the time, very bravely, I think we have to admit, adopted 83 of those recommendations. I don't know if anyone can guess what the 84th recommendation was. It was a medically supervised injection room. So I think they were quite smart to put that out there, because it meant that the politicians could say, well, we're not going to do that, but we will do this. So it kind of changed the perspective on what was being proposed. It was probably relevant that, just like Bob Hawke in those days, 1985 or so, before I came to Australia, the president's nephew and the youth minister's brother had both died from heroin overdoses around that time. So that really, just like Anastasia has talked about euthanasia laws because one of her family members died painfully, nothing like personal experience to bring the politicians to the table, is there? Now, it's interesting to note that this change in the law applies to all illicit drugs, not just soft cannabis. And it talks about personal use, which is defined as up to 10 days supply. Of course, that's open to interpretation. As we can see from this slide, heroina, morphina, cocaina, cannabis, MDMA, amphetamines. I don't have much Portuguese, but I think we can guess what they mean. 10 days is 1 gram of heroin. That's probably not going to get you that far. 2 grams of cocaine. So 25 grams of cannabis, a bit more generous. So that's the leaf, and then hashish. I won't try and pronounce that. So the levels weren't huge. Nevertheless, it set a very valuable precedent. MDMA 1 gram, amphetamines 1 gram. So it kind of set a mark below which the police could not exercise criminal sanctions against you. So here's a few photos from Portugal. This is a non-medically supervised injection room, which was on a bit of vacant land, and there was a guy looking after people, which was really good. I asked him about Narcan. He'd never heard of it. I was rather disappointed. So I tried to explain that it was quite handy if someone dropped in front of you. It will just go inside the non-medically supervised injection room. So a couple of seats, you can see an ashtray there, and it's not necessarily the highest standard of hygiene, but better than nothing, perhaps. If you're using with someone else, that's one of the first indicators of safety, isn't it? Now, this establishment of these dissuasion commissions was a key component. Instead of justice overseeing the harm reduction approach, which was operating from the early 90s, it was switched to health, which was a huge and important move. The commissions had 3 members, or have 3 members, 1 with a legal background, 2 with a health background, and they have this range of sanctions which they can apply. Getting people into treatment if they're drug dependent, getting them to report back, a bit like drug court might do, mandate community service, suspend their driver's license or other licenses to perform their work, which perhaps isn't great, and as a last resort generally issuing a fine. And if you don't want the money to go to the government, you can opt for an NGO to receive the money instead. That's quite enlightened, isn't it? And if you've got a drug dependence, they're not going to fine you, because there's no point, because you're just going to do more things to raise those funds, so it's not helpful. Now, before you go in front of the commission, you see a technical support team. So there's 3 or 4 health people who will perform a detailed assessment, determining whether this is personal recreational use or dependence or somewhere in between, and what sort of sanctions they would recommend. For the first offence and in the non-dependent user, which constitute 80 to 90% of the cases referred, it's likely that proceedings are suspended and no sanction at all is applied, other than your name goes on to the book for 6 months. And if you come back within those 6 months, then there's a sort of escalating response, because you've been dumb enough to get caught. If after 6 months you come back, then you start all over again. They had a no-show rate, just like our clinics, but they did a bit better than us, didn't they? Just 15%. 83% of the cases they did here were provisionally suspended, so nothing really happens. They've been seen and heard. It's a bit like the diversion here, I guess. You come and sit down for the lecture, and then you go off and go about your business. A small proportion punitive sanctions, of which only an even smaller proportion were fined, and a few were found innocent, which is refreshing, isn't it? Mostly cannabis, a bit of cocaine, heroin and poly drugs. And as it's a health issue now, not justice, the health system can cope with people deciding to continue using. This is one of the big differences that's resulted from that switch to the Department of Health. Justice can't cope with someone who says, oh, look, I'm going to carry on using on the weekends or on payday. That's how I want to spend my money. I'm not dependent, I make a choice. So here's Nuno Capaz. Poor fellow had a dreadful cold, so you can see the tissues and the red nose. So he was sneezing and spluttering. We didn't catch anything. But here is our Dissuasion Commission. So Rebecca, Trevor, and Ivan there, and I was the photographer. These are the files that they pointed to. Yes, does that sort of show? Yeah, so on the left. And just picture that each one represents a case being referred to them. The alternative from the past would have been a court hearing and a much larger file, the cost of which €500 for the court business, 200 to 250 euros for this business. So significant savings which can be channeled to trying to arrest Mr. Big, the real dealer there who never gets touched by all this street level police activity. And here we are with the methadone bus, just listening to how things go, and another photo of the bus and the group assembled. You can see the hatch at the back there, and here is someone dosing and someone else getting water from the bus. So this bus goes round. There are two of them in Lisbon. They have set times and locations. They're every day of the week. They also dose other medications if required, and they see 1,200 patients a day. And we saw very respectable looking business women getting out of cabs who were told to wait, coming in, giving their number. They don't have to give a name, it's anonymous, it's free, and getting their dose and then getting back in the taxi or driving up in their car. This is an underpass which had some opportunities to park. We then went to this street and outreach service. Used to have 160 staff because of funding problems, GFC, and a lower profile for drug-related problems, so almost a victim of their own success. Their staff has reduced dramatically. You can see there is a picture of a priest and various, so quite a strong Catholic focus, as you might expect from Portugal. And this is a residential rehab that was well out of town. This is the wood workshop where people got training. Next door there's a graphic design workshop, and there's also organic horticulture. So trying to really focus on rehabilitation as a pathway to recovery, giving people skills and opportunities for employment. For a while there was actually positive discrimination, so if you took on someone with a substance problem who'd been through some sort of program here, you actually got wages subsidised for 6 months, so there was a real incentive. Some of that has also dropped away, unfortunately. This rather grim, well, it's maybe, a building was under the flight path from the airport, so every 2 minutes, literally 10 feet above this building was this jumbo jet flight. I couldn't bear it. This is the inpatient withdrawal unit, and it was rather oppressive, I have to say. Firstly, it was locked, so that was the guard who had to unlock it to let us in. And this photo shows it's sort of grim and dark. And it really did seem to be going back to the Middle Ages a bit. We talked to some of the patients there. They only had 6. They were all smoking away furiously, which I'm sure wouldn't happen in Hads. And it didn't seem a terribly therapeutic environment. But, you know, it's fine for me to criticise, etc. You'll see the doctor who we spoke to. He had some patient art on the wall, and I was quite taken by this image. The recovered patient on the left, of course. Thanks very much. And so here is Miguel Vasconcelos, the Taipas Withdrawal Centre, which has now done 30 years. And in the past, as I've mentioned, it was Justice that ran the detox centre. I mean, do you really want policemen? You don't, do you? Now, it was interesting, this guy told us how much he was paid for his full-time job. Euros to dollars, I forgot to look it up, but it's $1,700 a month, euros a month. So that's 500 euros a week, which is maybe 900 Australian. He's a psychiatrist. So it is a bit different, and he has other activities to fund his. So here are the injection kits. The needles aren't pictured here, or maybe that's them there. I've just noticed them there. Yes. So interesting, not an insulin syringe, but a brown needle there. Notice these green polythene kits. There's the little trays for heating things up, the filters, the water which goes in, and I think that's a condom, and some wipes, some alcohol wipes. When we go back to the non-medically supervised injection room, you can see all these injection kits, unfortunately, just discarded. Of course, no story of Portugal would be complete without the custard tarts, which I didn't like very much, but they were everywhere. And I think this is a weed of national significance, isn't it? So not just in Australia. Thanks very much, the horticulturalists in the audience.
You've been pulling it out.
Exactly. I felt I should. Although in Japan, it was kind of labelled in one of the emperor's gardens. I was shocked. So forgive my accent. This is Dr. Goulart, who was in Brisbane just last week, but I missed it. He was giving us the kind of oversight of the entire program. So in the 90s, he was a GP, and he just got interested in the health problems that surrounded people who were using drugs. He got himself trained up. He was one of that 13-member panel, and since then he's really been the flag bearer for Portugal's success. We asked Nuno whether he'd had other groups dropping by, and I think it was Norway had brought a 20-person delegation just the day before, and someone else. So these poor guys, I mean, they were amazingly courteous and helpful, but they're just being swamped by interested visitors from around the world, including Queensland. And here we are leaving SICAD, which is where Dr. Zhao works. And again, I'm not in the photograph, but I was there, I promise. So it's not just about decriminalisation. As we said, that also has its shortcomings. It's a public health approach which must complement this. So they did have a harm reduction framework, though, as I've said, in a justice environment, that really doesn't work. So going to health was incredibly important. We know that education is a sort of two-edged sword, and often it misses its target or just frightens people away. So think of Nancy Reagan and Just Say No. So they actually tried to make it very much targeted for particular groups, long-term unemployed, school dropouts, sex workers, providing information, not trying to scare people, as our current government loves to do about the ice epidemic. So telling people it's safer to smoke heroin than to inject it. Can you see that happening in Australia? I fear not. And encouraging people to increase the age, delay the first use of a drug. I mean, that seems so sensible, but on the other hand, oh no, we can't encourage people to use drugs, can we? Free needle syringe at all pharmacies, no charge. And they've sort of developed their therapeutic communities. Initially it was just for heroin users, then they added people with cannabis or cocaine problems, and now they also include alcohol. So this is really the substance use writ large. And they have a kind of evidence-based approach, 12-step facilitation, cognitive therapy, motivation interview. And I've mentioned the other activities that are part of the rehabilitation, which was a strong focus. Reintegration. So housing first, shelters. I've mentioned the discrimination in employment. They run drop-in centres, staffed by health professionals. So the one downtown, 40 people dropping in a day. They have outreach teams providing food, so building that relationship, and they go on the same route each day, and they kind of explore the parts that other services don't reach. So we were climbing down embankments, going under bridges, wandering down the street. It was really quite surprising. The low threshold methadone, as I mentioned, 1,200 a day. You don't need to be absent. We recognise that. You don't need to supply a name. You just get a number when you register, and that's all you need to offer up. And they have nursing and medical team on the bus, and also allied health to support other aspects. This is from the European Drug Monitoring Agency, And I've added the Australian figures on top, just because it's quite interesting to compare a country with decriminalisation with Australia's approach. So we know that our population from 15 to 64 is about 2.5 times that of Portugal. Overdose deaths, they had 27 in 2016. Our latest figures, 1,700. HIV diagnosis, remember that was one of the drivers for this change, down to 30. Now our figures from the Pennington suggest that only 14 infections occurred with the most recent data, which I think is 2016, although there were 51 cases of MSM also injecting drug use, so that's sort of overlap. We certainly do better with needle and syringe distribution, which is quite interesting. We've got a similar number really of opioid treatment. The quantities of drugs seized in Australia, it's the amphetamines, the stimulants, cannabis coming last, whereas in Portugal, which is a well-recognised trafficking site for substances going from West Africa, maybe through Morocco to Portugal into Europe, cannabis is quite prevalent because Morocco grows a lot of cannabis, it seems. And these figures for high-risk opioid users, they're quite rubbery, I'm afraid, but roughly in proportion. So interesting to compare and contrast. Certainly we can't say that this is a doomsday scenario where all hell is breaking loose in Portugal compared with us locally. So I've just got a few maps, and this is Portugal for anyone who's geographically challenged. And the paler the colour, the better, the less. And let's take UK for a reference point. So when your colour here is paler than there, that means they're doing better with less usage. Better, they have less usage. That's cannabis. Here we have cocaine. Here we have MDMA. Here we have amphetamines, and finally heroin. And heroin's the only one which kind of matches up the sort of European average. The rest are significantly less. Rosa, she was the first police officer to arrest a sitting cabinet minister. So you can imagine. That was child sex offences, so not another illicit activity. It works. I wouldn't change it. It's better. It's a better approach to the problem. Do something better for everyone. Easier to send someone to treatment. Safer streets for our kids. So I thought that was a pretty helpful statement. Though we were going up in the lift to this very flash police headquarters. I haven't got the slide here, and we just mentioned why we're visiting to a couple of senior-looking police officers, and they weren't. So it wasn't uniformly embraced, but certainly in Rosa's case, she was very positive about it. Glenn Greenwald, some of you may have heard of him. He was part of the huge Panama Papers bust and various other really groundbreaking journalistic works. I asked Nuno if he remembered Glenn coming, and yes, Glenn was one of the first people to come through to assess the efficacy of this new policy. And his report makes good reading. And of course, there are still controversies about numbers. So those anti-decriminalisation have suggested there was an increase in murder rate related to this change. When you process the figures properly, this is not true, but it's the kind of fake news that gets invoked in these sorts of discussions. British Medical Journal, very respectable. Editorial, the war on drugs has failed. So let's just go through what they've been promoting. This is 2016, I don't think much has happened this way. Although cannabis is moving forward medicinally in the UK with those babies coming to politicians' attention, the fitting baby, it's a pretty powerful image. Not that cannabis necessarily heals all fitting babies. It does heal some. So decriminalising minor offences, strengthening health and social approaches, cautious move to regulated markets. We'll talk a bit more about that. Evaluate outcomes. We've got to measure what we're doing and see whether it's making these better. Pragmatic, rational policy. This is all fairly uncontroversial, you might think. We may have different approaches for different substances. So later on, we'll see that the softer drugs may have an earlier adoption approach, and then once you've got your model straightened out, you might move to your harder drugs, if I can use that. Promote education based on evidence, counselling, deterrence of use, and so. And we should have health right at the centre, with health professionals as well. So this is a civil society shadow report published just last year, and they kind of put together the data, which we won't be surprised to learn that drug-related deaths have increased very significantly just in the last 5 or more years. We've got transmissible diseases, we've got increased opium production, increased demand for across the range of substances, so amphetamines, ecstasy, cannabis, opioids. 803 new psychoactive substances coming along, so very difficult for legislation to keep up with all that, even though in Queensland we now say anything that purports to change your sensorium can be classified as an illicit drug. And this, I think, is a really fascinating area which might generate more traction. This is the largest illicit commodity market in the world, leading to enormous sums of money being laundered around the world. Here we have figures $400 to $600 billion. Now, we know the banks aren't necessarily squeaky clean here, and they're probably intimately involved. So that may be one of the pillars of the community which is going to be hostile to change. Nevertheless, that cannot be good for the world economy, that level of illicit and money laundering going on. Fascinating slide here. Crime pays. Estimated crime proceeds retained by criminal enterprises. Estimated crime proceeds seized by authorities. Is this value for money, do we think, folks? It's pretty shattering, isn't it, really? So there have been challenges for the Portuguese approach, as I intimated. So funding has dropped, partly GFC, partly lower profile, because drug problems are no longer seen as this big ticket issue. I've mentioned the low salaries, perhaps training. The policy has come under pressure with political change, though broadly both sides of politics have stuck with it. There has been a recent reform with a split management structure, and as we know, that's not necessarily the best way to run things. 2 branches with tensions and poor coordination between those 2 branches. And I think this is one of the most fundamental issues. The black market is still the source of supply. So we've got no control over quality, purity, availability, and so forth. And that's really the major flaw, I think, in the decriminalisation approach. You're still leaving things in the hands of the illicit drug dealers. When we're pushing for change, we should never underestimate the forces of darkness. It's hard to be rational about change when you believe your job depends on the status quo being maintained. So in the US, this is just an example, the following lobby groups have opposed medicinal and recreational cannabis: police, big pharma, big alcohol, prisons. I probably should have put banks on there as well, shouldn't I? So next time I will. Okay, so I quoted from this before. The findings of this year's World Drug Report make clear that the international community needs to step up its responses. You know, that's the same old, same old. One is reminded here of a comment attributed to Einstein, though he may not have made it. The definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over again, but expecting different results. And I didn't realise Maslow was the author of this quote. I suppose it's tempting, if the only tool you have is a hammer, to treat everything as if it were a nail. That's what UNODC does, I'm afraid. It's kind of made that link, and that's how everything is seen. So let's just take some extracts from the World Drug Report. Opium production up 65% between 16 and 17, and it's getting to be highest ever. Global cocaine, 2005 to 13, 56% up, and then another 25%, 15 to 16. Cannabis users increasing 16% in the decade ending 2016 in proportion with the world population growth. Methamphetamine, the second greatest drug threat in the United States after heroin. So, if you were a business reporting on your results, you'd be bankrupt. You know, your shares would go through the floor. Yet these guys just carry on saying we've got to do more of the same. It is completely bizarre. It's irrational. Just a local flavour. So Ross Coomber was here, I think, at QUT. I met him a few months ago. One of the authors of this description about social supply. This is buying and distributing for your mates or a group of users. You're not trying to make a huge profit. And of course, because you're spreading it around, the quantities involved may be greater than those intended for personal use. And at the moment, the quantity is really important in terms of what happens if you're caught. Because if you've got, 100 grams of cannabis, that's a trafficking offence. I don't have the exact quantities for each substance. However, the risk of this social supply network, mates looking after your mates approach, is that those who are doing the buying get caught up and end up with sentencing up to 25 years is what trafficking and possession is the maximum penalty in Queensland. And this is very much not what the legislation intended to do. So a great report here from the Global Commission on Drug Policy Regulation. And I think this is where we should be really pushing rather than decriminalisation. I put the faces up here because they're 23. There are 5 women. Unfortunately, Kofi Annan is dead. These are very old and grey. So here's a guy that you may have heard of, Volker, who used to run the World Bank. Here's Shanana Gushmal from East Timor. There are various worthy here's Helen Clark from New Zealand. So, these are the great and the good. It is a bit bizarre that people wait till that stage in their career to actually start pushing this sort of change. Where are the young guys? Where are the users represented on this group? Nick Clegg, he may be a user. He was a politician in the UK who lost his mojo. But you see what I'm saying, guys? I mean, these are not puffing away at cannabis or methamphetamine each night, are they? So that's a bit of a... But I suppose credibility, they do have influence and weight. Interesting, New Zealand, where APSAD was this year, although no one was really talking about it anymore, they tried the Psychoactive Substances Act, the first regulated market for novel psychoactive substances. As you saw, 803 over the last decade have come forwards. The producer had the burden of proof to show it was safe, and I think they used alcohol as their benchmark, which is fairly dangerous. So that gave quite a lot of scope, and it may have been 41, not 40, sorry, of the novel psychoactive substances cleared the interim safety hurdle. But then they got really bogged down. They hadn't done enough preparation. They didn't have enough resources for testing and evaluation. There was little thought given to availability or marketing or legal challenges. So after 9 months, the politicians got cold feet and dropped it. And it's kind of sitting around, but I don't think anything's happening. What they didn't do is tax it, because once you start taxing something, it's much more difficult to abandon it, because that's the revenue stream. Think of pokies. And they didn't try and control the prices. So there's a much better drawing in that in the Global Commission report than this one. But what it tries to suggest is we have this sweet spot. If you're running an entirely illegal system, then there's a lot of harm that results. People getting jailed, etc., etc. If you have a free market where everyone can do anything, there's a lot of harm that results. Drug use is not going to go away, so let us try and regulate it. And that way people know what they're buying. There's controls, just like we have on alcohol, not selling to under 18s, tobacco, etc. You can tax it, you can control the number of outlets, the number and density, you can control the manufacturing models. Do you limit the size? Do you limit it to various, maybe not-for-profits? Imagine Lives Live Well going into cannabis production. It's a possibility, I suppose. Imagine if the substances you purchase actually have the concentration and the ingredients on the packet. That'd be amazing, wouldn't it? So really we're talking about the model that's already well tried and tested and in place for alcohol and tobacco, being redirected for a regulatory model for control of substances. So there's certain things we really need to take into account. The threshold issue. In Russia they had a decriminalised model for a while, but they set the threshold as like 1 grain of heroin. So, even if... So it was actually escalating the legal interventions. It wasn't protecting anyone at all. So how do we define personal use, and what about social supply? And these unintended consequences around the world, they've been... the politicians think they've done the right thing by introducing those personal possession amounts, and then the police go crazy and everyone's getting locked up instead of being referred for health interventions. Diversion, how helpful is that for someone who's a recreational user? They may do the diversion to avoid a fine. Is compulsory education useful? Well, that's a question I leave with you. If you're really fining people heavily, then are you then going to be imprisoning them for non-payment of fines? And we see this in Australia with very unfavourable results at times. Who is the decision maker? The police, they have a very different agenda from the health professional. Is it the prosecutor? That means everything's got to go to the court. Is it the court itself? These are very cumbersome and legalistic ways forward. Just looking at the consequences of imprisonment here, this is census data. On the 1st of June 2017, there were almost 8,500 prisoners in Queensland, compared with 2010. This is the latest I could find. Almost 27% of people in jail were there for drug-related offences, mostly minor possession stuff. And so that proportion of the whole is increasing. We're building new prisons around the place at the moment. This is a huge expenditure by governments, often involving the private sector, so all those conflicts of interests emerging. It's a very unseemly spectacle in my view. When you get a criminal record, that can affect many aspects of your life, as I've listed there. And in Queensland, it's at least 5, maybe 10 years for a criminal record to be expunged. And depending on the seriousness, if you've been a serious violent offender, that probably can't be expunged at all. And as we've said, you might attract a 25-year jail sentence for possession and trafficking, which you would never get for murder, generally. I mean, there's just this huge irrational disproportion. Another very good report, Australia 21st, Shaping the Future. We all pay the price. Our drug laws are tearing apart Australia's social fabric, as well as harming drug users and families. We call on Australia's federal, state and territory governments to treat drug use primarily as a health and social issue, removing criminal sanctions for possession and personal use. So we've got a range of interactions with social disadvantage, causing harm through the courts, through child protection, housing availability and access. We've seen the pilot that's been introduced to drug test welfare recipients. I mean, how clever is that, really? Let's keep punishing people. It's always so productive, isn't it? Do we test MPs or staffers? Unfortunately not. Perhaps we should. Those sanctions, the debit card, and then mandated treatment. How well does mandated treatment actually deliver? So, I know this is a bit of a no-brainer for this audience. However, we tried to set a bit of a direction for the future. How do we proceed? And I think a regulatory model with small steps, incremental changes, start with the soft stuff and move forwards. We can't deny the war on drug users is causing more harm than good. 90% or so of harms from substances are from those two old favourites, aren't they? Portugal has shown that change can happen. You need the right sort of political environment and circumstances, don't you? So it helps when you've had family members of senior politicians affected. Human rights, I think, provides a very powerful framework for change. And as we've seen around the world, Ecuador, for example, many countries are moving in similar directions. And the UN conventions, of which there are 3, they're more than 100 years old, some of them. They are very cumbersome and very prescriptive and completely outdated. UN GAS, the General Special Assemblies, they had one on substances in 2016. There's another one due in 2019. It really didn't make much in the way of recommendations for change, unfortunately. So there's a very strong adherence to the status quo certainly from some countries, perhaps the US in particular. If we recognise that shift from a justice model to a health model, that is absolutely crucial to drive processes. And if we take a broad perspective, we were talking this morning about childhood trauma, adverse childhood events and substance use. There is such a strong relationship also with mental and physical health problems. Much problematic substance use reflects society, doesn't it? Disadvantage, trauma, adversity. Then we're really bringing a double punishment on those who have been affected during their upbringing, have found what is of course an imperfect solution. That is a health problem. It's not something that people should be locked up for, to learn how to be a serious criminal in the future. So, final slide, I think, abiding impressions from Lisbon. And it was interesting to see Ivan's response to some of the people he met, because I guess he's not in the clinical arena day to day. So firstly, recognition that this is a problem for society. It's not individuals, as the alcohol industry likes to target individual responsible drinking and stuff. This is actually much broader than that. And blaming people doesn't solve it at all. They were really working to combat stigma and marginalisation, so that positive discrimination in employment terms, really positive, and a non-judgmental and welcoming approach to users. So hopefully those are all bread and butter issues for us. We've got to get the message out there far and wide. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Jeremy, for a clear presentation of a different way to be managing what seems to be a growing problem throughout most societies. We'll see if there's any questions in the room. Yes?
Jeremy, it was very inspiring to see that even though they don't have, medically supervised injection rooms, and they've got somewhat poor resourcing of rehab and particularly inpatient rehab, their legislative change has had such a profound, and it'd be interesting to see if they were resourced appropriately, the even better outcomes that might apply.
Yeah. I mean, that reduction in overdose deaths and HIV, very dramatic, so really positive results. And I think evaluating the effects of your interventions, that's a central focus, isn't it? So it's a lesson for us all.
Do you have any thoughts on why the heroin use is still are not necessarily high?
Relatively.
Yeah, but relatively high?
No, I don't really know. I mean, I think, that we know there are patterns of use. It comes and goes. It's about availability and fashion and supply. And so I don't have a specific answer to that question. Thank you.
Thanks so much. That was awesome. Just wanted to know, what's your thoughts around the possibility of Australia adopting a Portugal model and timeframes? As in, have you spoken to people in the health system, and what are the thoughts or in the justice system about Australia adopting that model?
Well, as I said, Dr. Zhao was out last week, I think, talking at the Mental Health Commission's 2-day workshop. Certainly, I think the intention that Ivan expressed in making this trip and taking, I should have said Rebecca is the head of QNADA, and Trevor runs Najara, thank you, on the Sunshine Coast. So trying to really get some senior opinion formers, leaders, to see what things were like on the ground and then try and spread the word. So I guess this talk is one effort to spread the word. I haven't actually caught up with Ivan in the flesh since we got back, so it's really at the political level that pressure needs to be brought to bear. I mean, our patients are on the whole marginalised, disenfranchised. I thought it would be an interesting study to see how many of them actually vote, or how many on the electoral roll, because that would be, I think, a powerful measure of whether they're really participating. I talked to one patient at Melaleuca, and his response was, "Why the hell would I vote? What's the point?" And if that sort of thought was shared, then no wonder things aren't getting any better. We need to be advocates. So perhaps we should start writing to our politicians. If they got lots of mail about this, they might think differently on the subject.